Margaret Hayes settled into her first-class seat wearing a faded cardigan and comfortable slacks. Her worn canvas shoes a stark contrast to the luxury surrounding her. She smiled gently at the other passengers, unaware of the storm about to unfold. Victoria Cross, the senior flight attendant with her perfectly pressed uniform and signature silk scarf, took one look at the elderly woman and decided she didn't belong. What happened next would shock everyone aboard. Victoria's sneering condescension turned to public humiliation as she demanded Margaret move to economy, insisting these seats were for a certain class of people. The other first-class passengers watched, some with approval, as the 72-year-old woman gathered her belongings with quiet dignity. They had no idea who she really was. What the pilot did next left everyone speechless. Before I continue the story, please subscribe. I need to reach 1,000 subscribers so I can keep bringing you stories like this every day. It's just one click for you, but it means a lot to me. Thank you. Margaret Hayes moved through the chaos of Denver International Airport with the calm of someone who had seen it all before. At 72 years old, she carried only a small overnight bag slung over one shoulder, its fabric worn soft from years of use. Her cardigan had been a favorite for over a decade. The pale blue wool pilled at the elbows and stretched at the pockets, where she habitually tucked her hands. Her slacks were clean but faded, the kind bought for comfort rather than fashion, and her canvas shoes had molded perfectly to her feet after countless miles. Around her, travelers rushed past in designer athleisure and expensive business suits, pulling sleek luggage that cost more than her entire outfit. Margaret didn't notice, or perhaps she simply didn't care. She approached the check-in counter with a small smile, the kind that reached her eyes and spoke of genuine warmth. The young agent looked up from her screen and returned the smile. Margaret slid her identification across the counter, along with her confirmation number. "First class to Boston," the agent confirmed, her eyebrows raising slightly as she glanced between the modest woman before her and the ticket class displayed on her screen. Margaret nodded serenely. She was going to meet her great-grandson for the first time. A tiny miracle named Jacob, who had arrived 3 weeks early and stolen her heart through pixelated photographs. The agent processed her ticket, handed over the boarding pass, and wished her a pleasant flight. Margaret thanked her with such sincere gratitude that the agent found herself smiling long after the elderly woman had walked away. As Margaret made her way toward security, she paused to help a frazzled mother wrangle a dropped sippy cup, steadied an elderly man who stumbled with his carry-on, and offered directions to a confused tourist. Her movements held a quiet confidence, an ease in her own skin that spoke of someone comfortable with exactly who she was. When she removed her shoes at security, the TSA agent noticed something unusual. A faded tattoo on her ankle, small wings paired with what looked like coordinates. It was an odd detail, unexpected on a grandmother in discount clothing. But the line moved forward, and the moment passed. Margaret collected her belongings, slipped her worn shoes back on, and headed toward her gate with the same unhurried grace that had carried her through 7 decades of life. Margaret stepped onto the aircraft and turned left into first class, a space she knew intimately, though decades had passed since she last flew in uniform. The cabin gleamed with carefully curated luxury, leather seats in rich cream tones, each one wide enough to feel like a personal throne, polished wood accents catching the soft overhead lighting, and the hushed atmosphere of exclusivity that money deliberately purchased. She located her seat, 3A, by the window, and settled in with a soft sigh of relief, her small bag tucked easily into the space beneath the seat in front of her. She ran her hand along the armrest, fingers tracing the smooth leather, and something flickered across her face, a memory, perhaps, before her gentle smile returned. Victoria Cross noticed the elderly woman immediately. As senior flight attendant on this route for the past 8 years, Victoria prided herself on her ability to read passengers within seconds of seeing them. She had cultivated her appearance meticulously, her uniform pressed to razor-sharp creases, her dark hair pulled into a flawless bun without a single strand out of place, her makeup applied with precision, and her signature silk scarf, a deep burgundy Hermès that cost more than most people's monthly rent, knotted at her throat in a perfect bow. She believed presentation was everything, that you could judge a person's worth by how they presented themselves to the world. And this woman in seat 3A presented all wrong. Victoria's eyes narrowed as she observed Margaret from her position near the galley. The cardigan was absolutely inappropriate for first class, worn and stretched as though it had been purchased from a discount bin years ago. The slacks had no discernible brand, just generic beige fabric that hung loosely on the woman's thin frame. And those shoes, Victoria thought, with an internal shudder. Those canvas shoes belonged in a garden, not in her cabin. She watched as Margaret gazed out the window with an expression of contentment, utterly unaware or unconcerned with how out of place she appeared among the other first-class passengers now boarding. A man in a tailored Armani suit took the seat across the aisle, his Italian leather briefcase gleaming. Behind him, a woman dripping in Cartier jewelry settled into her seat with the casual elegance of someone accustomed to luxury. And there sat this elderly woman in her threadbare cardigan, looking perfectly comfortable where she clearly didn't belong. Victoria straightened her scarf and made a decision. Someone had made a mistake, either at the gate or in booking, and it was her responsibility to maintain the standards of first class. Victoria smoothed her scarf and approached seat 3A with her most professional smile, the one she had perfected over years of dealing with passengers she deemed beneath her standards. She stopped beside Margaret and let her smile tighten just slightly at the corners. A barely perceptible shift that transformed warmth into condescension. "Excuse me, ma'am," Victoria said, her voice carrying that particular tone of false sweetness that masked judgment. "I believe you may be in the wrong section." Margaret looked up from the window, her expression open and kind. She reached into her cardigan pocket and withdrew her boarding pass, extending it toward Victoria without a hint of defensiveness. "I'm in seat 3A," she said gently, her voice steady and calm. Victoria took the boarding pass between two fingers, as though it might be contaminated, and held it up to scrutinize every detail. Her eyes scanned the printed information multiple times, searching for the error that must surely be there. The seat assignment was correct. The passenger name matched. The ticket class clearly stated first. Victoria's jaw tightened imperceptibly. "Sometimes the system makes errors," Victoria said, her tone suggesting she was doing Margaret a tremendous favor by bringing this to her attention. "These things happen, especially with online booking platforms. They can be quite confusing for people who aren't familiar with air travel." Margaret's expression didn't change, though something flickered in her eyes, something that might have been amusement or perhaps recognition of exactly what was happening. "I'm quite familiar with the booking system," Margaret replied quietly. "I purchased this ticket myself 3 weeks ago." Victoria's smile grew more strained. She glanced at Margaret's clothing again, letting her gaze linger pointedly on the worn cardigan and faded slacks. "I see," she said slowly, as though speaking to someone who might not fully understand. "But do you understand what first class means?" "It's our premium cabin. Quite expensive, really. Designed for a particular type of traveler." The implication hung in the air between them, heavy and unmistakable. Margaret met Victoria's eyes directly, her own gaze clear and steady. "I understand perfectly," she said. Victoria's fingers tapped against the boarding pass, her perfectly manicured nails clicking a rhythm of irritation. "Well," she said, drawing out the word, "sometimes there are system glitches that assign seats incorrectly, or perhaps there was a misunderstanding about what was being purchased. These tickets are usually several $1,000s. Margaret simply nodded. "Yes," she agreed calmly. "They are." Victoria handed the boarding pass back to Margaret with a thin smile that had shed any pretense of warmth. "Perhaps," she said, her voice carrying just slightly louder than necessary, "you would be more comfortable in our economy cabin. It's really quite nice, and honestly, for someone like yourself, the difference wouldn't be very noticeable. The seats are perfectly adequate." The businessman across the aisle lowered his newspaper, his attention caught by Victoria's tone. The woman with the Cartier jewelry paused in arranging her belongings to watch. 2 rows back, a silver-haired executive in a Tom Ford suit leaned forward with interest. Victoria noticed her growing audience and seemed to draw energy from it, standing a little straighter, her voice gaining confidence. Margaret remained seated, her hands folded calmly in her lap, her expression unchanged. "I purchased a first-class ticket," she said clearly, "and I intend to use the seat I paid for. I'm perfectly comfortable here." Victoria's laugh was short and sharp, designed to humiliate. "Ma'am," she said, and the word dripped with condescension, "I'm trying to help you avoid an embarrassing situation. These tickets are very expensive, and I'm concerned there's been some kind of mistake. Perhaps someone purchased this for you as a gift, and there was confusion?" Margaret's voice remained steady, though a faint color rose in her cheeks. "There has been no mistake. I purchased this ticket with my own credit card. I have the confirmation email and the receipt. I have every right to sit here." The other passengers exchanged glances. The businessman smirked slightly, shaking his head as he returned to his newspaper. The woman in Cartier whispered something to her companion that made him chuckle. Victoria sensed their approval and pressed forward, emboldened. "With all due respect," Victoria said, her tone making clear she had no respect whatsoever. "These seats are for a certain class of people. People who are accustomed to this level of service and luxury. People who understand the expectations and standards we maintain in this cabin. I'm sure you're a lovely person, but you must understand that sometimes we all need to recognize where we truly belong." Margaret's hands tightened slightly in her lap, the only outward sign of her internal response. She took a slow, measured breath before speaking. "I belong exactly where I chose to sit," she said quietly, her dignity intact despite the public humiliation unfolding around her. Victoria crossed her arms, her scarf slightly askew now from her growing agitation. Victoria turned toward the galley and raised her hand, gesturing sharply to catch the attention of another flight attendant. A younger woman in the same uniform hurried over, her expression uncertain as she approached. Victoria didn't wait for her to speak. "We have a situation with this passenger," Victoria announced, her voice loud enough that every person in first class could hear clearly. She gestured toward Margaret as though indicating an object rather than a person, not making eye contact with the elderly woman at all. The younger flight attendant glanced between Victoria and Margaret, confusion crossing her features. "I'm not sure I understand," she began. But Victoria cut her off with a wave of her hand. "This woman is sitting in first class," Victoria continued, speaking about Margaret, as though she had suddenly become invisible, or perhaps deaf. "I believe she may have confused her ticket. Or possibly she found a boarding pass that wasn't hers. You know how these things happen. People pick up the wrong documents at security. Or sometimes they find things left behind at the gate." The implication was unmistakable, the accusation hanging in the air like smoke. Victoria was suggesting theft, or at the very least fraudulent use of a ticket. Several passengers audibly gasped. The businessman across the aisle folded his newspaper completely now, fully invested in the unfolding drama. The woman in Cartier actually smiled, a cruel upturn of her lips that said she was enjoying the spectacle. Margaret's face flushed deeper, but she kept her gaze steady, fixed on a point just beyond Victoria's shoulder. She took a deep, steadying breath, the kind that comes from years of practice maintaining composure under pressure. Her hands remained folded in her lap, though her knuckles had gone white. "I have shown you my boarding pass," Margaret said, her voice quieter now but no less firm. "It has my name on it. It matches my identification. I purchased this ticket legally and properly. I have every right to be here." Victoria made a show of sighing deeply, turning to her colleague with an expression of exaggerated patience. "You see what I'm dealing with," she said. "Some people simply refuse to acknowledge when they've made a mistake." The younger flight attendant shifted uncomfortably, clearly uncertain about how to proceed. She opened her mouth to speak, but Victoria continued her monologue. "I've been doing this job for 8 years, Victoria said, addressing the other passengers now as much as her colleague. "I know when something doesn't add up. I have an eye for these things." The younger flight attendant, whose name tag read Sophie Chen, looked increasingly uncomfortable as Victoria's voice grew louder and more accusatory. Sophie was only 24 years old, just 6 months into her position with the airline, and she had never witnessed anything quite like this before. Something about the situation felt deeply wrong to her, though she couldn't quite articulate why. The elderly woman sat with such quiet dignity, such calm composure in the face of Victoria's increasingly hostile behavior, that Sophie found herself doubting her senior colleague's judgment. "Perhaps we could just check the passenger manifest," Sophie suggested gently, trying to inject reason into the situation. "That would clear everything up immediately. If her name is on the list for seat 3A, then there's no issue at all." Victoria turned to Sophie with a look of withering disdain. "I don't need to check the manifest," she said sharply. "I can see perfectly well what's happening here. You're new, Sophie, so let me explain something to you. Part of maintaining standards in first class is knowing who belongs here and who doesn't. It's something you develop with experience." Sophie's cheeks colored, but she persisted. "But if we just verify," she started, and Victoria cut her off with a raised hand. "I said I don't need to verify anything," Victoria snapped. "Now either help me resolve this situation or return to your duties." Sophie fell silent, her discomfort written plainly across her face. She glanced at Margaret with apologetic eyes, but said nothing more. Around them, the other first-class passengers had divided into clear camps. Some shifted uncomfortably in their seats, averting their eyes from the confrontation, as though pretending not to witness it might absolve them of complicity. A younger man in business casual looked actively distressed, his hand moving toward his call button before hesitating and pulling back. Others leaned in with undisguised interest, whispering to their companions behind raised hands. The woman in Cartier jewelry murmured something that made her seatmate laugh unkindly, but it was the woman in the cream-colored Chanel suit and triple strand of pearls, seated 2 rows behind Margaret, who provided the most damning reaction. She caught Victoria's eye and gave a small, approving nod. Her posture suggested she believed Victoria was performing an important service, protecting the sanctity of first class from those who didn't deserve to be there. Victoria saw that nod, and it fortified her resolve. Victoria drew herself up to her full height, her decision made, and her conviction absolute. She pointed toward the curtain separating first class from the rest of the aircraft. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to insist that you move to the economy cabin," she declared, her voice ringing with authority. "I will not have you disrupting my cabin and making the other passengers uncomfortable. This is my final decision." Margaret sat still for a long moment, her eyes on Victoria's face, reading something there that made her expression shift from calm to something deeper, something like sadness. Then, without a word of protest, she reached down and gathered her small overnight bag from beneath the seat in front of her. The gesture was slow and deliberate, carried out with the same quiet grace she had displayed throughout the entire confrontation. Sophie stepped forward, her voice urgent but quiet. "Miss Cross, I really think we should check with the captain or the gate," she said. "This doesn't seem right. We could be making a serious mistake here." Victoria's head snapped toward Sophie, her eyes flashing with fury. Her voice dropped to a venomous whisper that somehow carried more threat than her earlier volume. "I told you to either help or get out of my way. If you question my authority again, I will write you up for insubordination. Do you understand me?" Sophie's face went pale. She stepped back, her hands trembling slightly, her eyes bright with unshed tears of frustration and shame. Margaret stood slowly, shouldering her bag with movements that betrayed a lifetime of practice. She smoothed her cardigan with one hand, a gesture of composure, of refusing to let them see her spirit broken even as her face burned with humiliation. She turned toward the aisle and began the long walk toward economy. The businessman across the aisle smirked openly now, shaking his head as though he had just witnessed justice served. The woman in Cartier wrinkled her nose in distaste as Margaret passed. The wealthy woman in pearls actually turned in her seat to watch Margaret's retreat, her expression smug with satisfaction. A few passengers had the decency to look away, unable to meet Margaret's eyes as she walked past, their discomfort with the situation outweighed by their unwillingness to speak up and risk becoming targets themselves. Margaret kept her head high, her shoulders back, walking with a steady gait that refused to hurry despite the weight of dozens of judging eyes on her back. Victoria watched with her arms crossed, her scarf perfectly in place once more, a small smile of triumph playing at the corners of her mouth. Sophie followed Margaret through the curtain into business class, her heart heavy with guilt and confusion. She had been taught that her senior colleagues knew best. That experience meant wisdom. But everything about this situation felt wrong in a way she couldn't ignore. Margaret moved through business class with her head held high, past passengers who glanced up from their tablets and magazines with idle curiosity. She continued through the next curtain into economy, where the seats were narrower and arranged in groups of 3, where families juggled restless children and business travelers worked on laptops, balanced precariously on tray tables. Sophie touched Margaret's elbow gently, leaning close to speak in a voice barely above a whisper. "I'm so sorry," she said, the words tumbling out in a rush. "I should have done more. I should have insisted we check. I should have stood up to her. This isn't right. I know it isn't right." Margaret paused and turned to face the young woman, her expression softening with genuine kindness. She reached out and patted Sophie's hand, where it still rested on her arm. "Dear, this is not your fault," Margaret said firmly but gently. "You tried. You spoke up when others stayed silent. That took courage, especially against someone in authority. Don't carry shame for someone else's choices." Sophie's eyes welled with tears that she blinked back rapidly. "But I could have done more," she whispered. Margaret shook her head. "Sometimes we do what we can in the moment, and that has to be enough. You were kind. That matters more than you know." They found an empty row near the back of the economy cabin, and Margaret slid into the window seat with practiced ease. She placed her bag beneath the seat and settled herself as though this had been her intended destination all along, refusing to let the indignity of the situation diminish her composure. Sophie lingered in the aisle, unable to simply walk away. As she stood there, something caught her eye, a glint of metal on Margaret's cardigan near the collar. She leaned slightly closer, and her breath caught. It was a pin, small and tarnished with age, but unmistakable in its design. A set of wings, the kind pilots wore, crafted in gold or perhaps gold plate worn down over decades. The style was older, vintage, not the modern design Sophie had seen on the pilots who flew today. Beneath the wings were tiny engraved details she couldn't quite make out from where she stood. Sophie walked slowly back toward first class, her mind churning with questions about that pin, about the way Margaret had moved through the aircraft with such familiarity, and about the quiet authority in her voice when she had spoken. But duty called, and Sophie had preparations to complete before takeoff. She pushed through the curtain into first class, where Victoria stood near the galley, straightening her burgundy scarf with visible satisfaction. Another flight attendant, an older man named Robert, was checking the overhead bins, and Victoria leaned toward him with a conspiratorial smile. "Well, that situation is resolved," Victoria announced, her voice carrying that same smug tone she had used throughout the confrontation. "Sometimes you have to maintain standards, you know. We can't just let anyone sit wherever they please simply because they manage to get their hands on a boarding pass." Robert glanced at her with raised eyebrows. "What do you mean, get their hands on a boarding pass?" he asked. Victoria waved her hand dismissively. "Oh, you know how it is. People find things, or they book tickets they can't really afford, and then act surprised when we question them." That elderly woman was clearly out of her element. "I had to move her to economy where she belongs." Robert's expression suggested he had questions, but the pre-flight timeline pressed forward, and he returned to his duties without comment. Victoria busied herself with final cabin checks, ensuring every pillow was perfectly positioned, every amenity kit placed just so in the seat pockets. The aircraft pushed back from the gate with the familiar mechanical whir and gentle jolt. Outside the windows, the ground crew disconnected their equipment and gave their final signals. The plane began its slow taxi toward the runway, joining the queue of aircraft waiting for clearance. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as the safety video began to play on the seatback screens. Then the intercom crackled to life with the distinctive sound of the flight deck calling. "Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen." A warm male voice filled the cabin. "This is Captain James Mitchell speaking. I'd like to welcome you aboard Flight 743 with service to Boston. Our flight time today will be approximately 3 hours and 45 minutes. In economy, Sophie was working her way down the aisle, checking seatbelts when she heard the captain's voice. She glanced toward Margaret's row and found the elderly woman gazing out the window with that same serene expression, seemingly unbothered by everything that had transpired. Captain Mitchell's voice continued over the intercom, warm with genuine pleasure. Before we begin our taxi to the runway, I want to take a moment to acknowledge that we have someone very special with us today. It's not often we have the privilege of flying with a true aviation legend, someone who paved the way for so many of us in the cockpit. I'm going to step back for just a moment to personally pay my respects. Victoria's entire demeanor transformed. Her spine straightened even further. Her hand went to her scarf to ensure it was perfectly arranged, and a smile of anticipation spread across her face. She glanced at Robert with barely concealed pride, as though to say, "You see, even the captain recognizes excellence when he sees it." She positioned herself near the cockpit door, assuming the captain would emerge to greet her, to acknowledge her 8 years of service and her unwavering commitment to maintaining the standards of first class. The businessman across from Margaret's former seat chuckled, assuming the captain must be referring to him, perhaps recognizing his name from some Forbes list. The woman in pearls sat up straighter, wondering if she was the legend in question. The cockpit door opened, and Captain James Mitchell stepped into the cabin. He was a man in his early 50s with silver threading through his dark hair, his uniform crisp and bearing the 4 stripes of a captain. His face was open and friendly, creased with smile lines around his eyes. Victoria stepped forward with her hand extended, her smile brilliant and expectant. "Captain Mitchell," she began, "I'm so honored that you would." But the captain walked right past her. His eyes scanned the first-class cabin briefly, then moved to the curtain separating first class from business. His expression shifted to confusion, then concern. Victoria's hand hung in the air, her smile frozen and beginning to crack at the edges. Robert watched with growing interest as the captain continued moving toward the back of the aircraft. "Excuse me," Victoria called after him, her voice uncertain now. Captain Mitchell didn't pause. He pushed through the curtain into business class, his pace quickening. Passengers in business craned their necks to watch him pass. He continued through the next curtain into economy, his eyes searching the rows of seats. Captain Mitchell spotted Margaret in the window seat near the back of economy and stopped so abruptly that a passenger behind him nearly collided with his shoulder. His face registered shock first, his eyes widening and his mouth opening slightly. Then that shock transformed rapidly into something darker, something that looked very much like anger. "Mrs. Hayes," he said, his voice loud enough to carry through the cabin, drawing the attention of every passenger within earshot. "What are you doing back here?" Margaret looked up from the window and her face broke into a genuinely warm smile, the kind reserved for old friends. "Hello, James," she said, her voice carrying the easy familiarity of someone who had known the captain for many years. "There was a small misunderstanding about my seat. I'm perfectly fine back here, truly." The captain's jaw tightened visibly. His hands clenched at his sides, and he took a slow breath as though trying to control his response. "A misunderstanding," he repeated, his voice carefully measured but vibrating with barely suppressed fury. "Mrs. Hayes, you had a first-class ticket. I know you did because I personally called the airline when I saw your name on the manifest to ensure everything was arranged properly for your trip." Margaret's smile faded slightly, and she nodded. "Yes, I did have a first-class seat," she acknowledged. Captain Mitchell's eyes swept the economy cabin, taking in where she sat, then returned to her face. "Who was responsible for this?" he asked, and his tone made clear that someone would answer for what had happened. Sophie had been standing frozen several rows away, her face pale as she watched the scene unfold. Now the captain's gaze found her and she swallowed hard, her throat working visibly. "Sophie," Captain Mitchell said, recognizing her from previous flights, "can you tell me what happened here?" Sophie's voice came out small and shaky at first, then gained strength as she spoke. "Miss Cross, the senior flight attendant. She questioned Mrs. Hayes's boarding pass. She said that Mrs. Hayes didn't belong in first class, that there must have been a mistake. I suggested we check the manifest, but Miss Cross refused. She insisted that Mrs. Hayes move to economy, the The captain's expression grew darker with every word. Around them, passengers had abandoned all pretense of minding their own business, every eye fixed on the unfolding drama. Captain Mitchell straightened to his full height, his face set with determination and righteous anger. He reached up and pressed the call button above Margaret's seat, activating the cabin-wide intercom system. When he spoke, his voice carried through every speaker in the aircraft, reaching every passenger from first class to the last row of economy. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Mitchell speaking again. I need to share something with all of you, and I need you to listen carefully. The cabin fell silent, every conversation stopping mid-sentence. Every passenger turning their attention to the voice filling the space around them. In first class, Victoria's face had gone pale, her hand gripping the galley counter for support. "This woman seated here in economy is Mrs. Margaret Hayes," the captain continued, his voice resonating with pride and barely controlled anger. 50 years ago, she became the second woman ever to fly commercial jets for a major airline in this country, at a time when the cockpit was considered no place for a woman. When she faced discrimination and doubt at every turn, she proved herself to be one of the finest pilots this industry has ever seen. Margaret's cheeks flushed, and she shook her head slightly, clearly uncomfortable with the attention, but Captain Mitchell continued without pause. "Mrs. Hayes trained half the pilots currently flying for this company, including me. I had the privilege of learning from her 23 years ago when I was a nervous first officer who could barely land in crosswinds. She taught me everything I know about flying with precision, with integrity, and with respect for every single person who trusts us with their lives. She is a decorated captain who flew over 30,000 hours without a single incident. Not one in a career spanning 3 decades. The passengers in economy had turned in their seats, craning to see Margaret, who sat perfectly still with tears gathering in her eyes. The captain's voice grew stronger, more passionate. "Mrs. Hayes revolutionized safety protocols that are still used today by every major airline. The pre-flight checklist modifications she developed after the '78 incident in Dallas saved countless lives. She served as chief flight instructor for 12 years. She mentored over 200 pilots. She broke barriers and opened doors for every woman who followed her into the cockpit." Captain Mitchell paused, letting his words sink in throughout the cabin, then delivered the final piece of information with quiet intensity. "Mrs. Hayes also happens to sit on the board of directors of this airline. She has served in that capacity for the past 7 years, helping guide policy and ensure that we maintain not just safety standards, but standards of human decency and respect for every passenger who flies with us." The gasps were audible throughout the aircraft, a collective intake of breath that seemed to ripple from first class all the way to the back. In the galley, Victoria's face drained of all color, her carefully applied makeup suddenly garish against skin gone pale as paper. Her mouth opened and closed silently, her hands trembling as they released the counter she had been gripping. Her professional veneer, so carefully maintained throughout her 8-year career, cracked completely. She stumbled forward, nearly tripping over her own feet as she pushed through the curtains toward economy. "No," she whispered, then louder. "No, no, no, this can't be." Captain Mitchell stepped aside as Victoria reached Margaret's row, her eyes wild with panic. "Mrs. Hayes, I didn't," Victoria stammered, her words tumbling over each other incoherently. I mean, you were dressed, I assumed. Oh, God, I'm so sorry. I didn't know. I never would have. Please, you have to understand." Margaret looked up at her with that same calm expression she had maintained throughout the entire ordeal. Her hands folded peacefully in her lap. She said nothing, simply observed Victoria's frantic apologies with the detached interest of someone watching a play unfold. In first class, the woman in pearls had pressed one hand to her mouth, her face flushed with mortification. Her earlier satisfaction had transformed into visible horror as she realized she had approved of the humiliation of a company board member, an aviation legend. The businessman who had smirked during Margaret's walk of shame now stared fixedly at his newspaper, his face red, unwilling to meet anyone's eyes. The woman in Cartier jewelry had gone very still, her expression frozen. Throughout the first-class cabin, passengers who had watched Margaret's removal with approval or indifference now looked profoundly uncomfortable, some whispering urgent apologies to each other, as though trying to establish that they had disagreed with Victoria's actions all along. Captain Mitchell turned away from Victoria's stammering apologies and moved with purpose toward the front of the aircraft. He picked up the handset for the internal communication system and pressed the button that connected him directly to the flight deck. "Mark," he said, speaking to his first officer, "we need to return to the gate immediately. Contact ground control and let them know we have a passenger service issue that must be resolved before departure." There was a brief pause. Then the first officer's voice crackled back with confusion but compliance. "Roger that." Returning to gate, Captain Mitchell replaced the handset and turned to find Victoria had followed him. Her face streaked with tears that had ruined her perfect makeup. "Captain, please," she said, her voice breaking. "It was just a misunderstanding. I made a mistake. We don't need to return to the gate. We can resolve this right now. I'll move Mrs. Hayes back to first class immediately. Please, my job, my career." The captain's expression remained hard as stone. He crossed his arms and looked at Victoria with an intensity that made her step backward. "You didn't make a mistake, Miss Cross," he said, his voice cold enough to freeze. "You made a choice. You looked at a passenger and decided based solely on her appearance that she didn't belong in first class." Victoria opened her mouth to protest, but the captain continued, his words cutting through her attempts at explanation. "She just looked like she was in the wrong place," Victoria said desperately. "Her clothes, her shoes. She didn't present herself like the other first-class passengers. I was trying to maintain standards. I've always maintained standards. That's my job." Captain Mitchell leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping to a level that somehow carried more weight than shouting. "Let me be absolutely clear about what happened here," he said. "You judged a passenger solely on her appearance and removed her from her rightfully purchased seat. You spoke about her as though she wasn't present. You accused her of potentially stealing a boarding pass. You dismissed your colleague's reasonable suggestion to verify the manifest. That's not maintaining standards, Miss Cross. That's discrimination." The word hung in the air like an accusation, which it was. Victoria's face crumpled, and she shook her head frantically. "No, I wouldn't," she protested weakly. But her words had no conviction behind them. The plane completed its slow journey back to the gate, the mechanical sounds of connection echoing through the tense cabin. The moment the seatbelt sign chimed off, the forward door opened, and 3 airline management personnel in dark suits boarded the aircraft with grim expressions. They moved directly to where Captain Mitchell stood waiting, and he spoke to them in low, urgent tones. Gesturing toward economy where Margaret Still Saturday, the lead manager, a woman in her 40s with steel-gray hair pulled into a severe bun, listened intently, her face growing increasingly grave. She nodded once, twice, then made her way down the aisle with purpose. "Mrs. Hayes," the manager said, as she reached Margaret's seat, her voice filled with genuine distress and contrition. "I'm Janet Morrison, the Regional Operations Manager. On behalf of this airline, I offer you my most sincere and profound apologies for what has happened today. This is absolutely inexcusable. Please, allow us to escort you back to your proper seat in first class." Margaret allowed herself to be helped from her seat, and the walk back through the aircraft was entirely different from her earlier humiliation. Janet Morrison personally carried Margaret's bag, and the other 2 managers flanked them like an honor guard. When they passed through first class, every passenger who had watched Margaret's removal now averted their eyes in shame. Victoria stood near the galley, her face blotchy and swollen from crying, as she watched Margaret return to seat 3A. Once Margaret was settled, the gate manager, a tall man with kind eyes, crouched in the aisle beside her seat. "Mrs. Hayes," he said quietly, "I cannot express how deeply sorry we are. I would very much appreciate the opportunity to speak with you privately about this incident once we land in Boston, if you're willing. We take this matter with the utmost seriousness." Margaret nodded graciously, her dignity never wavering despite everything she had endured. Janet Morrison approached Victoria with 2 security personnel behind her. "Miss Cross, please gather your personal belongings and exit the aircraft," she said, her voice brooking no argument. "You are suspended, effective immediately, pending a full investigation into this incident." Victoria's eyes went wide with panic. "Please," she begged, reaching out toward Janet. "I've worked here for 8 years. I made one mistake. I didn't know who she was. If you had known who I was, that would have been the only reason to treat me with respect," Margaret said quietly from her seat, speaking for the first time since the captain's revelation. Victoria had no response. She gathered her bag with shaking hands and walked off the plane, her head down, her career hanging by a thread. Sophie watched from her position near the galley, her heart pounding as she witnessed the consequences of silence and the price of prejudice. The airline managers remained on board for another 15 minutes, documenting every detail of the incident. Sophie was interviewed, her account recorded with meticulous care. Robert provided his observations. Captain Mitchell gave a detailed statement about the discriminatory treatment he had witnessed upon entering the cabin. Janet Morrison sat with Margaret, a tablet in her lap, typing notes as they spoke. "Mrs. Hayes," Janet said carefully, "you would be well within your rights to press charges against Miss Cross and to pursue legal action against the airline. What happened today was discrimination, pure and simple, and we will support whatever course of action you choose to take." Margaret shook her head slowly, her expression thoughtful rather than angry. "I don't want to destroy that young woman's life," she said quietly. "I want her to learn from this. I want the airline to examine how someone could work here for 8 years and believe this behavior was acceptable. I want training, real training, about implicit bias and dignity. I want systemic change, not just punishment for one person." Janet nodded, with visible relief and respect. "We will absolutely make that happen," she promised. "Would you be willing to meet with our executive leadership team to discuss comprehensive policy changes?" Margaret agreed with a small smile. Once the managers departed and the cabin door closed for the second time, the atmosphere in first class remained heavy with tension and shame. The businessman across the aisle was the first to stand and approach Margaret's seat. "Ma'am," he said, his voice rough with embarrassment, "I owe you an apology. I watched what happened to you, and I did nothing. Worse than nothing, I found it amusing. That says something terrible about me, and I'm deeply sorry." Margaret accepted his apology with grace. 2 other passengers followed, each offering their own awkward but sincere expressions of regret. Then the woman in pearls rose from her seat, moving slowly as though her legs barely supported her weight. She stopped beside Margaret and for a long moment simply stood there, tears streaming down her face. "I nodded at her," the woman whispered, her voice breaking. "When that flight attendant was humiliating you?" I nodded my approval. "I thought you didn't belong here because of how you were dressed. I thought I was better than you because of my jewelry and my clothes and my seat assignment." The flight finally departed with a new senior attendant, a composed man in his 50s named David, who treated every passenger with quiet professionalism and genuine warmth. The aircraft climbed to cruising altitude, and the seatbelt sign chimed off, releasing the cabin from its enforced stillness. Captain Mitchell emerged from the cockpit once the plane had leveled off, making his way directly to seat 3A, where Margaret sat gazing out at the cloud formations below. He pulled down the empty jump seat across from her and settled in with a warm smile. "Do you remember teaching me barrel rolls in that old simulator?" he asked. And Margaret laughed, a genuine sound of delight that seemed to lift some of the remaining tension from the cabin. "I remember you nearly threw up afterward," she replied, her eyes twinkling. "You turned absolutely green and had to sit with your head between your knees for 20 minutes. They fell into easy conversation, trading stories from decades of flying. Margaret spoke about her first solo flight in a commercial jet, how her hands had trembled on the controls, and how she had landed so smoothly that the passengers applauded, having no idea how terrified their pilot had been. She talked about flying through a hurricane to evacuate patients from a hospital, about emergency landings that required split-second decisions, about the profound responsibility of holding hundreds of lives in your hands every time you pushed the throttle forward. The passengers nearby had stopped pretending not to listen. They leaned in, captivated by her stories, by the quiet authority in her voice that spoke of true experience and hard-won wisdom. The businessman asked if she had her pilot's license with her, and Margaret smiled and pulled out her phone instead. She scrolled through photos, turning the screen to show images of herself in uniform from decades past. There she stood beside a massive jet, young and determined, her hair dark and pulled back, her uniform crisp, her expression serious and proud. Another photo showed her in the cockpit, her hands on the controls, surrounded by instruments that looked impossibly complex. A third captured her receiving an award, shaking hands with an airline executive while a crowd applauded. The woman in pearls asked permission to look at the photos more closely, and Margaret handed over her phone without hesitation. Sophie had remained nearby throughout the flight, finding reasons to check on Margaret's comfort, bringing her water without being asked, ensuring her needs were met with an attentiveness born of genuine care and lingering guilt. As Captain Mitchell returned to the cockpit and the other passengers settled back into their own activities, Sophie crouched beside Margaret's seat, her expression earnest and troubled. "Mrs. Hayes," she began quietly, "what happened today? I can't stop thinking about how I should have done more." Margaret turned from the window to face the young woman fully, and her expression was gentle but serious. "You did speak up, dear," she said. "That took courage, but I can see you're troubled, so let me share something with you. This isn't the first time I've faced judgment like this." Sophie's eyes widened slightly as Margaret continued. "When I started flying commercial jets 50 years ago, male pilots would refuse to fly with me. Passengers would demand to get off the plane when they learned a woman was in the cockpit. I had my abilities questioned constantly, my decisions second-guessed, my presence challenged. I had to be twice as good to be considered half as competent." Margaret's voice remained calm, factual, without bitterness. "And now," she said with a small, sad smile, "I face a different kind of judgment. I'm an old woman now. People see the gray hair, the wrinkles, the comfortable shoes, and they make assumptions. They see someone past their usefulness, someone who couldn't possibly have accomplished anything significant, someone who doesn't deserve respect or consideration." Sophie's eyes filled with tears. "That's so unfair," she whispered. Margaret nodded. "It is unfair. But here's what I've learned, and I want you to remember this for the rest of your career and your life. Every single person who boards this aircraft has a story. Every person has dignity and worth that has nothing to do with their clothing or their age or their appearance. The person in sweatpants might be a surgeon rushing to save a life. The elderly man with the cane might be a war hero. The young woman with the crying baby might be a brilliant scientist. You cannot know someone's value by looking at them." Sophie wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "How do you stay so calm about it?" she asked. "How do you not get angry?" Margaret's smile widened slightly. "Oh, I get angry," she said, "but I've learned that dignity is the most powerful response to indignity." 6 months had passed since that flight, and Victoria Cross stood in Terminal C at Denver International Airport, wearing a volunteer badge and a humble expression that would have been unrecognizable to anyone who had known her before. She had completed an intensive 12-week diversity and sensitivity training program, participated in facilitated discussions about implicit bias and prejudice, and spent countless hours in therapy examining the beliefs that had shaped her harmful behavior. The airline had reassigned her to a logistics coordination role in the operations center, a non-customer-facing position where she processed flight plans and managed crew scheduling. It was a significant demotion from her previous position, a consequence she had accepted without protest. But she was working her way back through demonstrated change, through consistent effort to become someone different, someone better. Every Saturday morning for the past 4 months, Victoria had volunteered with Silver Wings Assistance, an organization dedicated to helping elderly and disabled passengers navigate the complexities of modern air travel. She guided seniors through security, helped them understand boarding procedures, carried their bags, and ensured they reached their gates with dignity and support. The work was humbling in ways she could never have imagined. She met retired teachers, former business owners, war veterans, artists, scientists, grandparents traveling to meet new grandbabies. Each person had a lifetime of experiences and accomplishments that she would never have known if she had judged them solely by their appearance. She met women who reminded her painfully of Margaret Hayes, women in comfortable clothes and worn shoes who spoke with quiet authority about careers in medicine or law or education, who had broken barriers and changed their fields. The airline itself had undergone significant changes. Margaret Hayes had indeed met with executive leadership, and her recommendations had resulted in a complete overhaul of customer service training protocols. Every employee now completed mandatory implicit bias training annually. The company had established an anonymous reporting system for discriminatory behavior and a passenger advocacy board that included Margaret herself. New policies explicitly protected passengers from removal or relocation based on appearance, age, or perceived socioeconomic status. Victoria carried a photo in her wallet now, one she had printed from a company newsletter. It showed Margaret Hayes receiving the airline's Lifetime Achievement Award at a ceremony 3 months after the incident. Victoria looked at it often, a reminder of her own capacity for cruelty and her responsibility to be better. Margaret's story did not end with that flight. A passenger had recorded portions of Captain Mitchell's announcement on their phone, and within days the video had spread across social media platforms. Viewed millions of times, the story sparked conversations in online forums, news programs, and dinner tables across the country about ageism, about the snap judgments we make based on appearance, about the invisible stories carried by every person we encounter. The airline faced significant public scrutiny, but chose to respond with transparency and action. The CEO issued a public apology, acknowledging systemic failures in training and oversight that had allowed discriminatory behavior to flourish. 3 months after the incident, the company announced the establishment of the Margaret Hayes Award, presented quarterly to employees who demonstrate exceptional dignity, respect, and advocacy for all passengers, regardless of their appearance or perceived status. The first recipient was Sophie Chen, who had found her voice after that transformative flight and become a fierce advocate for passenger rights. Margaret continued her work on the board of directors, using her influence to ensure that the changes implemented were meaningful and lasting. She visited training sessions to share her story directly with new employees, speaking with the same quiet dignity she had displayed in Seat 3A that day. She reminded them that every passenger boarding their aircraft deserved to be treated with respect, that clothing and appearances revealed nothing about character or worth, that kindness costs nothing but means everything. Now, it is important to ask yourself, have you ever judged someone based on their appearance, only to discover you were completely wrong? Have you witnessed someone being treated poorly because they didn't look the part, didn't dress the right way, didn't fit someone else's narrow definition of who belongs? Think about the assumptions you make when you see an elderly person, someone in worn clothing, someone who doesn't conform to your expectations. What stories are you missing? What wisdom are you dismissing? What opportunities for connection are you losing because you decided in seconds that someone wasn't worth your respect? Margaret Hayes wore a threadbare cardigan and old canvas shoes, and beneath that simple exterior was a lifetime of courage, skill, and barrier-breaking achievement. The next person you meet might carry equally profound stories beneath their surface. Treat everyone with dignity. Look beyond the exterior. Remember that true worth has nothing to do with designer labels or expensive accessories. Share your own experiences of being judged or of judging others. Reflect on how you can do better, be better, see better. That is how we create a world where no one is removed from their rightful seat because someone else decided they didn't look like they belonged.